I wanted to start with Carol Krinsky, who was my undergraduate professor at NYU, who told me I should not become an art history major. She gave me a lot of other good advice and really took me seriously as a 19-year-old undergraduate. And to my great amazement, she was my undergraduate teacher. She's still teaching at NYU, a full load of classes at 82. So I failed in emulating her career. I think a couple of people mentioned that I started in archaeology, and Norman Hammond, despite his other defects as a human being, invited me to go to then British Honduras when I was 19 years old to work on an archaeological project. And really my first and greatest love that motivated me to go to graduate school and in anthropology was archaeology, and he gave me the opportunities of a lifetime. I found a bucket of jade, not something that every archaeologist gets to do. I got to visit an archaeological site that had just been discovered, and this picture shows me, I just lifted up that giant stone with a jack, and I stuck my hand underneath it and felt that there was carving on the stone. And later that afternoon, we turned it over, and that's what was on the stone. And it had been protected by being face down in the earth since the 8th century. And the text has since been read. And anyway, while I was working at this site, I met some indigenous people who gradually convinced me that it was more important to work with living people and that I should exercise my talents in that direction. And the other person who really helped me along in that direction was Joseph Palacio, Dr. Joseph Palacio, the first Belizean anthropologist with a PhD in anthropology, who's devoted most of his career to maintaining the traditions of the Garifuna people in Belize through lots of research and publications, and really an important person in my life in getting me to engage with the politics of archaeology. And in fact, at the 1975 AAA meetings, we put on a community session on what anthropology could do for the country of Belize. We had over 100 Belizeans from the Los Angeles community come to that session. And it was really my first experience with mixing academia with politics in a way that took seriously the kinds of concerns that indigenous people had, that Belizeans had, and made me want to blur that boundary between academia and real life, everyday life. And my mentor in graduate school, Bob Netting, he was like, after I had seen a lot of very bad behavior amongst archaeologists and senior anthropologists at Arizona, where I was in graduate school, he provided a kind of model of somebody who did conscientious anthropology and who worked really hard at it and yet was a humane person, a person who became my friend as well as my mentor. And in fact, he was living with us in Indiana when our daughter was born. I also have to thank the people in Toledo District in Belize who tolerated my presence for a year doing my dissertation fieldwork. And that's a story that continues because I was back in Belize, in southern Belize, just a few weeks ago. Was it 2 weeks ago, I think, for the first session I've ever been to where two different indigenous peoples groups in Belize asked 12 scholars to come and consult with them and to give them the benefit of our knowledge and our experience in what is now a very crucial time period where they are writing the regulations for their own management of their own land. I also have to thank Emilio Moran, even though he later probably regretted it. Nevertheless, he pushed really hard to hire me at Indiana University, which is where I've been ever since, and which is a very amazingly progressive and tolerant institution, considering that it's located in one of the most conservative states in the country. And again, I've been going back and forth participating in the court case being pursued by the Kekchi and Mopan people of southern Belize for their rights to the land that they've been living on as indigenous people. And Antoinette Moore and Christina Koch were two of the principals. Actually, Antoinette is a lawyer who was doing this on a voluntary basis. And Christina is an activist who we'll probably see next week. And this is at the Belize Supreme Court where I testified in 1995 and 1997. I also have to thank one of my best friends and colleagues, Orvar Lofgren, who taught me that good scholarship could be fun, and that fun should be an essential part of what we do, not because of its intellectual content, but because it keeps us honest with each other and makes us aware of our humanity, which is something easy to lose. Now, these are not my last two PhD students, but they're the last two who let me hood them in a ceremony, in a graduation ceremony. And Lyra Spang is the first Belizean PhD that I've ever managed to attract and shepherd through our food studies program. And by way of saying what I'm working on now, that I've retired, has been these two organizations. The Institute is a complex story, although I invite everybody here to become a member, which costs nothing and carries no privileges. But it's also the academic side of our charitable foundation, the Open Anthropology Foundation. And we've worked out an agreement with the Wenner-Gren Foundation. We're going to raise enough money to endow a grant at the Wenner-Gren Foundation that will be reserved every year for a person from another country who wants to study the United States. That's because we don't have enough people giving us that parallax, that other vision of what the United States looks like to an outsider. And we often expect foreign graduate students to go home and study their own culture. And then we also expect our American graduate students to go somewhere else and study somebody else's culture. Although that's changed quite a bit, it hasn't changed enough. So I'm going to ask David to hand out the descriptions of the fund right here. We have a very ambitious fundraising goal of $500,000. But I can promise that the first 10 contributions that come in after this conference will get a free wooden bowl made by myself in exchange and in thanks for the contributions. We can, as of yesterday, we can take PayPal contributions as well. And we should have a website up by the end of the week. Several people in the group had asked me to fill them in on what else I was working on before I get to the academic part. And a major project that I just got a grant to conduct is to explore the carbon impact of billionaires and the super rich who now own a disproportionately large and continually growing portion of the wealth in the world. And it's not about the rich parts of the world and the poor parts of the world. It's about the very small group of rich people who own so much of the world. And as long as they are having 9 houses and 3 500-foot yachts and their own airplanes, it really is difficult to argue that it makes a difference for me to compost my garbage and put up some solar panels on my roof. So the project is aimed at carbon shaming the super rich. And it turns out that, as far as we can tell, nobody has done this, has actually sat down and calculated what the carbon footprint of a billionaire might be. So I've hired an investigative journalist who I'm going to be working with over the next year to try to put this together, and then to open up the possibility of using shame and public shame as a way of controlling the behavior of the super rich. This is what I promised to talk about. So I'm going to talk about this for a little while, and I'm going to try to leave some room at the end for questions. But the issue here really came home to me when I was living in Singapore last year and the year before last. And Singapore had just applied to UNESCO to put Singapore's hawker culture, street food basically, on the register as intangible cultural property, which immediately raised the question of what was Singaporean food, and why was the same food being served across the straits in Malaysia, 300 yards away, why that was not also Singaporean food. And in fact, Malaysia immediately opposed this. But the very idea that a nation has a cuisine, or a group of people has a cuisine, or a place is inevitably going to have its own flavors associated with it, is obvious to us in a way that requires question. And that's really what I want to ask here, and that is, how was it that it seemed natural that a place and a people should have their own cuisine? It seems, as I said, it seems obvious, but actually the way it happens is messy and mysterious. And if you go and you look at cases like Yunnan tea, or Fiji water, or Oregon virgin water from the Oregon skies, or even something as placed firmly as Camembert in its own village of Camembert, which turns out to have been named after the cheese, rather than the cheese being named after the place. And in fact, it was a recipe for cheese that was imported from somewhere else in France. And it wasn't until the Emperor Napoleon III came to the village and said, yes, this is the place where real Camembert cheese comes from, that Camembert actually started advertising itself as the home of this particular cheese. So when you look at how these connections between place and taste are made, it turns out that there is machinery there. that there is a cultural process, that there's a historical set of questions, and a form of selection that has been operating for a long time, and I want to argue is connected to people's sense and ideas about the relationship between food and health. So, really, I'm just restating the question here. How did it become natural to associate food with a source and with terroir? I mean, you can say, yes, Gravenstein apples raised in Oregon taste better than the ones that are raised somewhere else. But why do we call it Gravenstein apples? And how do we say that one kind of apple is emblematic of a particular place and not of other places where it also grows? There is a large literature on authenticity that I'm going to completely dodge around now. And instead I want to bring up actually a book by one of the people who wrote a nice commentary about me, and here I am saying that I think his book is wrong. But I do. It's called Knowing Where It Comes From, very recent. And he traces these geographic indications, the modern ones we have, to the late 19th century, a product of the collaboration between government and business and kind of local boosterism that was taking place throughout the world at the time. And especially in a world where trade was increasingly free, so that people were competing with imports. Producers of cheese in Italy were competing with cheap cheese from Bulgaria. They still are. But I think that he's wrong. There we are. Because he doesn't take this far back enough in time to recognize that over time and in different parts of the world, people have connected place and taste, place and food in very different ways. So that it's not just that there's one system that was invented in the 19th century and has that's then spread around the world. There are actually contending systems that identify foods and other material culture with particular places. And one way of getting into this, and this is from a book by Rebecca Earle about the kinds of foods that were grown by the conquistadores who came from Spain in the 16th century and subjugated most of the New World. She says these people were operating under humoral medicine, a system of humours codified in ancient Greece and Rome and developed then by Islamic scholars in the 14th century and the 15th century, and then brought back into Europe, often by the agency of Jewish translators, and became very well established in the 15th and 16th century, especially in Southern Europe. And if you don't know the humoral system, it says that we all have 4 different basic vital bodily fluids: bile, black bile, blood, yellow bile, and phlegm, as Anne is demonstrating for me at this very moment. And they're associated with temperatures and with moist and dry conditions. They're also associated with seasons, and they're associated with types of weather. And the theory says that the balance of humors in your body determines your personality. But it can be affected by things in the external world. So you carry a balance of humors from birth, but then as you grow into a living and functioning human being, your humoral balance is affected by climate, by food, by exercise, sleep, your toilet habits, and by your emotions. So it's common for people to say, oh, well, the humours determine your emotions. But actually, according to Avicenna and some of the Galenic theorists, it mostly went the other way around, that if you got angry too much, you could make yourself sick by disrupting the balance of the four fluids in your body. So generally, illness is caused by a lack of balance. And you can correct that balance with certain foodstuffs, for example, but also by purging or bloodletting, or a change in location, or a change in exercise, or a change in your sleep patterns. All of these things were said to affect the balance of humours in your body. What this means is that a person who changes location or climate or diet, like a conquistador going from central Spain to, say, Yucatan, runs the danger of becoming ill. Or worse, by eating the foods and experiencing the climate of that location, they will be degraded into the same level as the native inhabitants of that place. So if you, as a Spaniard, go to Yucatan and you eat Yucatecan food, you breathe their air, you drink their water, you dress like they do, over time you're going to become more and more like them, and your children are going to become more and more Mexican, more and more indigenous as time goes on. And as far as the Spanish were concerned, this was a terrible tragedy. So maintaining your complexion, the color of your skin, your identity, your health, required eating the foods of home. But it didn't require that those foods of home be grown at home. Diet was the key to good health, and any change in diet could be dangerous. In fact, you could die from just changing your diet too quickly. So the idea that when you're hot and sweaty and you drink cold water, it's going to make you sick, this comes to us from the humoral theory of medicine. And you can hear people tell it to you today in many parts of the world. In fact, the first archaeological project I worked on, the person in charge of food was British, and when we came in from work, hot and sweaty, she gave us tepid tea, which did not appeal to the Americans in the group, I can add. So they're seeing the human body as something porous and permeable, and therefore the New World could infiltrate and make people less civilized, make men much less manly. So humoral theory says, just keep, as long as you're drinking wine, eating meat, and depending on wheat, later rice was acceptable as your staple food, and getting plenty of olive oil in your diet. Little garlic wouldn't hurt, but those substances had to be part of your diet if you wanted to maintain your Spanish superiority to the natives. It didn't matter if the wine was grown in Peru or grown in Spain. It didn't matter if it came from France or Italy or Mexico. It doesn't matter where the beef comes from. It doesn't matter where the olive trees grow. What matters is that you're having those same accustomed substances that made you Spanish to begin with, and which will continue to keep you superior to the natives. Now, what you see over the ensuing 17th and 18th centuries in most of the Americas is a kind of clash between theories of race, inchoate theories of race, and these humoral ideas about eating European food, dressing, wearing European clothes. And by the 19th century, these become very clear, and they tend to be called liberal or conservative parties, or liberal and conservative beliefs about how a country should be treating its indigenous population. And the liberal theory says, if we can teach indigenous people to eat wheat and plenty of meat and drink wine and have olive oil and other European foods in their diet, they will gradually be uplifted. And their skin will get lighter, they will become less lazy, they will become smarter, they'll learn to speak Spanish. All of these things are part and parcel of becoming a civilized person. There was a growing conservative belief, though, based on racial theories, that Indians and indigenous people are just a separate subspecies of human beings, and no amount of Spanish dress or Spanish language or Spanish food is ever going to lift them up. So it's better for them to live in their own communities where they can eat as much corn as they want. And the best we can do is to treat them in a paternal way as the kinds of inferior childlike beasts that they are. And of course, neither of these attitudes is presently acceptable, but you have to recognize the foundation in humoral theory. But at the same time, the Spanish and the Portuguese, and to some extent the Dutch, were out conquering the rest of the world and bringing their humoral theories with them. There was a radical change going on in the rejection of Galenic theory in particularly Northern Europe, and it was quite closely connected with the Protestant Reformation and all of the other rebellions against Catholicism. And before attacking the church, intellectuals attacked the Galenic theory of humours. So, Galen and Avicenna, who propounded humoralism, were being challenged by people who did science, what they called natural science. And historians of science trace much of modern biological science back to these groups of people who decided that they were going to study the world empirically, and that they were going to enumerate the plants and the animals. This is the root of the Linnaean classification, the idea that all creatures can be integrated in one way or another into a single scientific classification and nomenclature. One of the earliest was the Garden of Health. Remember, this is connecting not humours to health, but it's connecting plants and rocks and water and air in local places to health in a very radically different way. So these are systematic descriptions of plants, herbs, animals. And the people who are advocating for this are also helping to invent the natural sciences. They're creating botanical gardens around universities for the first time. Oh, let's get rid of that. Gesner, it's amazing how many of these people gravitated to Geneva and in what we would now call Switzerland, because it was a place where you could write things and publish them without getting arrested and having your head cut off. And rather than attacking Galenic theory directly, what they did was to argue that there was an order in nature, that human beings could learn to read, and in doing so, they would become closer to God. so that rather than going through the Catholic Church and all of its rituals, you could perceive God's works by studying plants and animals and rocks and understanding the natural world, which is, after all, God's creation and their thinking. And probably the most famous of these characters in this Enlightenment scientific movement is the person we now call Paracelsus, but who had this quite long title. He was something of a theologian and a naturalist. He was arrested and ejected from many different cities as he traveled around Europe and ended up in Geneva. And his argument was that when you learn about the plants and the animals and the water and the air and the geology of a particular locale, you find the key to health. Not humours and not some kind of mysterious liquids, but Paracelsus says these Southern Europeans and these Jews who are bringing all of these new medicines from the Near East and from China and from the New World are a bunch of charlatans. Because if you're born and raised in a place, only the food, the herbs, the air, and the water of that particular place can make you healthy. In fact, by eating things that come from other areas or using medicines that come from exotic foreign places, you're endangering your health. And you should be looking instead to your local herbs and your local curers and herbalists and doctors who have paid close attention to what grows there and what lives there. Local ingredients are good. Foreign substances are going to disrupt your health and produce disease. And it can only be restored by not just some kind of generic wine, but wine that comes from the place that you are native to. And only those indigenous substances can cure you. A lot of people who later developed water cures, and this whole idea of going to spas and drinking the waters, really descends from Paracelsus and from the idea that water has this natural power to bring substances into your body and to restore balance of health. And he saw this. I mean, remember, the nation state is still 300 years away in its modern form. But he believed that there were races that were identified by language, and he identifies himself as German. And again, we're talking 300 years before there was a place called Germany. But he said German people should be taking German medicines and listening to German doctors and not listening to foreigners. And the two basic things that he sees creates nativity, creates this close bond between a person and their natural environment. One is the geography, and the second is time. So you're born there, you're raised there, your family has been there for generation after generation. And for this reason, the wisdom of the elders needs to be captured and recorded just the same way we record the names of the plants and the names of the stars and the names of the different kinds of rocks and minerals that you find on the planet. And it's interesting because, to me especially, because space and time continue to be the way that authenticity is constructed in contemporary consumer culture and marketing. And if Paracelsus could have anticipated what people were going to do with these ideas about space and time, creating authenticity, I think he would be quite sick. himself and unbalanced himself, because rather than being a kind of abstemious practice of keeping yourself close to your native grounds, or if you move somewhere else, you have to continue to bring those things from your native environment. So bottled water developed in the 16th century, partially as a result of Paracelsus's ideas. So we find that Dutch adventurers going to Southeast Asia often carried bottles of Dutch water with them. And I'm sure the stuff was disgusting by the time 6 months of sailing voyage had gone on, but it was treated as a kind of tonic and medicine that could restore balance in your body if you caught one of those tropical diseases. If you look at modern campaigns that are intended to convince you that your food is good for you, you'll find that space and time are still the two main tools that people use to sell it. But there were other geopolitical events going on that changed people's ideas about health. And the British came up with a variation of Paracelsian theory, which said that basically the empire is the unit of analysis, and it is within the empire, the British Empire in particular, that we can create the kinds of substances that are going to be healthy and restore health to people who are sick. And throughout the British Empire, and I could go on and on about this given my research on food in Belize, part of the British Empire, and Singapore, part of the British Empire. In both places, the import of food from England was crucially important in maintaining a European lifestyle. British colonists were advised that eating local food could kill you, basically, that it was bad for you. And going native, while acceptable in 16th and 17th century India, for example, before India became part of the British Empire, by the 19th century, when it becomes part of the British Empire, empire branding becomes very important as a marker of British identity and of maintaining the dominance of the Raj and the superiority of British people over indigenous people. If you look at the patterns of trade in the British Empire, what you see over and over again is raw materials that go from colonies to the metropolitan center, often London or Birmingham or Manchester, where they are repackaged, graded, and often mixed together and processed and repackaged, and then sent back out to the colonies as something British. So it comes from the empire, but the tea grown in Kenya is not being traded directly to the tea drinkers in Jamaica. The tea from Kenya is going to London, where it is graded, packaged, and branded with a British brand, and then is sent to places like Jamaica, where people drink English tea. So there's a kind of magic to the empire brand, but it is usually couched in terms of untouched by human hands, processed by scientific equipment, graded by skilled people, and kept pure and unadulterated. You never know what's going to be in some kind of anonymous can of beef. The only guarantee you have is if it's a can of bully beef that comes from Ireland or Great Britain or Canada, but certainly not something from another country where it's going to be unsanitary. Here's a list of the things that you're going to find in every ex-British colony. that are still part of the diet and are still seen by most people as upper class kinds of food, the kind of food that a civilized person is going to want on their table. And someone needs to do a dissertation on Milo, because Milo is like a super processed product that has things in it like exhausted brewer's yeast, much like Bovril, which is Marmite, which is exhausted brewer's yeast that's been boiled with with hydrochloric acid. And that's how you hydrolyze it into that lovely substance. In Singapore, people eat they eat Heinz's baked beans on toast. I found this appalling, personally, having grown up partially in the UK. But the idea that you have people in this paradise of exotic and interesting cuisine dumping a can of Campbell's baked beans onto a piece of white toast for lunch, I found really difficult to explain. And this empire branding, and I'm sorry, I think I messed up the phasing on this particular slide. But there were empire shops all over England. People in England were encouraged to eat stuff from the colonies, and people in the colonies were encouraged to eat stuff from England. And some of the advertising is racist, blatantly racist. In this case, it's actually Libby, McNeil and Libby, which is an American company, but a lot of their beef came from Ireland originally. You also see a lot of colonial images that get reproduced on the packaging of these colonial foods. This one is pretty, Huntley and Palmer's, they're still exporting biscuits out to the places that used to be part of the empire. Originally, if you go back to the 19th century, you find that the advice being given to expatriates, civil servants who were coming out to serve in Singapore as a customs official or as a government functionary, they're told to eat lightly and to restrict the amount of local food that they're going to eat pretty dramatically if they want to maintain their health. So I spent part of my time in Singapore reading the recommendations given to colonial officials about how they should eat and what they should eat. There was a miasma theory of disease that was quite prevalent in the British Empire, which said that specifically indigenous native people, they live in dirty, unhygienic areas that generate unhealthy air. And that unhealthy air can make a white person, a foreigner, sick. So the racism of the British Empire is not just about work and categories of people, it's also about where people live, it's about what people eat, it's about what kinds of clothes they should wear, what kinds of hats they should have on their heads, and the kinds of medicine that they should be taking, almost all of which comes from Great Britain directly. Some of those brands, again, they're still there. Lydia Pinkham's tablets in most of the Americas, it's amazing how much patent medicine from the 19th century continues to circulate in parts of the ex-British Empire. Moving this towards the present, there's a whole part here which I've skipped in the interest of brevity, which is about how the Chinese humoral system interdigitated with the European one. And one of the things that becomes immediately clear in Singapore is that the boundary between food and medicine does not exist. many of the favorite foods in Singapore, like bak kut teh. That's an herbal broth that's made with medicinal herbs, and it's made to kind of taste bitter and not taste particularly good. But then you put the pork ribs in it, and that makes it a lot better. But my students in my classes in Singapore were insistent that particular kinds of fish should be eaten by particular kinds of people at particular times of year. And that it was not good to mix certain hot and cold foods. So again, I could go off on a long narrative here about hot and cold and how that particular system, again, has created a particular kind of dietary health regime in Eastern Asia. But interestingly enough, now they are importing notions of terroir that come directly from European and American marketing practices. And they're built on narratives and stories that not only emphasize the place of origin, the kind of terroir of the 19th century. You could think about the chateau of southern France as a model of specifically looking at soil, sunlight, water, climate. But increasingly in the 20th century, terroir has also been associated with craft skills and with quality. So if you look at the way, for instance, Maine cheeses are marketed and why people are willing to pay $20 a pound for a piece of Maine cheese, a lot of it makes reference, as Amy Trubeck shows, to stories and narratives about the gaining of skill and knowledge and the practices of organic agriculture and of proper treatment of animals, which had nothing to do with the terroir of the 19th century, which didn't pay much attention to animals. But that notion of place and people and connection between products and places is around us all the time. If you go and you look in almost any convenience store, you will be exposed to enormous amounts of marketing that make reference to imaginary places, like the Valley of the Jolly Green Giant. I don't know if people know that, but it's a real place now. It started as a fantasy, and then actually a group of people got together in a valley, I think in Minnesota, and said, we're going to be the Valley of the Jolly Green Giant. So life imitates advertising in this particular case. But I've never had a group of students who could not identify these three characters. Exactly.
There's no audio at all.
Oh, I'm sorry. Snap, crackle, and pop. My students in Singapore, most of them could recognize these three characters. So not only have we gone to an imaginary landscape, but we have imaginary people who people this landscape. So these magical agents are celebrities, and here we have Shirley Temple just started the process of merging celebrity with building brands. But Chef Boyardee, Aunt Jemima, the Green Giant, these people are just completely conjured out of thin air. Now, again, this is something that most of my students in Singapore had no idea about, but which American students in the Midwest identify completely. And that is the growth of a brand associated with a place in the space of about 30 or 40 years, less than a single generation. And in this case, it's the city of Cincinnati and what has become known as Cincinnati chili, which is actually a thin liquid made partially out of ground beef. It has a lot of cinnamon in it, and it's actually got a kind of sweet. Yeah, it's. But there's a whole lore, and there's a whole set of ideas about it. And if you tell a person from Cincinnati that it's gross, you're going to have an argument on your hands. There's also a whole set of ideas about how it should be served. So there's like the one-way, the two-way, the three-way, the four-way, and the five-way. You're adding hand-chopped onions. You're putting it over spaghetti. And you're putting grated cheese on top, and the end looks something like that, which is a five-way, and Skyline Chili is the #1 brand in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati people feel a kind of a closeness to it, even after they've moved away for long periods of time. People talk about kind of having cans of Skyline chili sent from the United States to the space station for people who crave their five-way chili. They got French wine last week, I believe, on the International Space Station. But here we have, again, time and place being used as a way of establishing a brand in a way that Paracelsus would probably not approve. And I don't think anybody thinks that Skyline brand chili is a health food. I don't think so. But anyway, I will leave it there. I think I've used all of my time. Is there time for some questions? Okay. I've only covered like 600 years in the entire globe. Before David asks his question, I just want to point out one very influential person in my undergraduate career was Constance Sutton, who is David's mother. And she gave me my first class in Caribbean anthropology, got me interested in households and household organization and gender within households. I very proudly sent her a thank you card when I became a full professor, because I felt like she had been such a strong influence on my career.
I was going to mention that in my little talk, Rick. Thanks for stealing it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was thinking about these 600 years while you were talking, and I was like trying to map all this in my mind. So I just wanted to kind of see if I could get this a little more lines going in different directions. So both like Paracelsus and the early humoral theorists seemed like they both had a kind of almost Herderian romantic notion of culture, even though they were pushing it in very different directions. And then that gets challenged maybe by Enlightenment thinking, where science comes in.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering about how Boaz might fit into this story, because I always think about how Boaz was like discovering that the immigrants eating an American diet suddenly start to look like Americans. And this was like always taught to me like a great empirical discovery, but maybe he was connecting it to some of these older ideas too.
It's a good point, and it's a good question. One of the parts that I cut out is some references to German scholasticism, which kind of grew out of the natural history approach of Paracelsus and others. And by the middle of the 19th century, German science has divided up the world into subjects, so astronomy, biology. No, food was not part of that classification. But they've also sought to divide the world into natural areas, the Köppen classification of climates is still used, and is still used as a way of showing how climate and culture often go together. So you have this history of anthropogeography in Germany, which basically says that people's personalities are determined by the temperature and the landform and dominant winds. And what they did was they went out into a world and they drew these discrete little territories and gave each of them an ethnic label. So the place I know best, Guatemala and southern Belize, it had kingdoms, a whole series of different kingdoms when the Spanish arrived. But by the 19th century, every group, every inch of Guatemala has been put inside a circle or a strangely shaped object which is labeled with a particular ethnic group. So the Kekchi lived here, the Mopan lived here, the Itza lived here, and it's a kind of carrying out of this Paracelsian program to the level of classifying the peoples of Earth. And again, associating them with terrain and with natural landforms, and of course with what they eat, because what they eat connects them with the land. And despite the fact that people are still multilingual in most of these areas, languages are still used as a way of classifying groups of people in any part of the world into these ethnic maps, which never have any overlap and kind of do a disservice to anybody who's got mixed ancestry, whose parents spoke two or three different languages, so that, you're only supposed to have one, according to this scheme.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about Singapore's application to UNESCO and their justification that Singaporean food is different from Malaysian food or some other kind of food, yeah.
This is really a fascinating question because Singaporeans, they don't talk about the weather, it's always the same. They don't talk about politics because you can get in trouble. And what they talk about is food, endlessly. And the nation has been divided up into ethnic groups. So when you're born, you get an ethnic group on your birth papers, it goes in your passport. And every school is supposed to enroll people in the same proportions as the nation. The same with jobs. You're supposed to be seeking to hire people in the same proportions that they exist in the nation. So you can go and you can look at something like the parathas they make in Singapore, prata. It's not made the same as a paratha in India, and it's not made in the same way they make them in Malaysia or in Indonesia, but people will tell you that's Indian food. Because every food gets this kind of ethnic label, just as you have ethnic people who have these labels. But it's a multi-ethnic society where people are mating across boundaries constantly, and somehow the state is always trying to reconstitute them into these ethnic groups. So you have to kind of decide, because the only mixed category is Eurasian, which is not a particularly desirable thing for a lot of people of Chinese origin. And to be called Chinese, well, you have Peranicans who have been there for 500 years, mixing with refugees from Hong Kong. They have almost nothing in common, but they're still lumped together as if they're Chinese. So the process of dividing things into ethnic groups keeps people from recognizing that there really is something called Singaporean food. And you can go to a Singaporean restaurant, I'm sure there's at least one or two here in Vancouver, and you will get dishes that you would not get in a Malaysian restaurant or that you would not get in an Indonesian restaurant, that any Singaporean will instantly recognize that chili crab, that's not something eaten anywhere except Singapore. But so we have this kind of, I think it's very common in multicultural nations, that the growth of a national identity is kind of stunted when you have an official policy of multi-ethnic harmony. Yeah.
Is there a, sorry about that.
I'm just trying to get
Is there a,
I'm just trying to get the light out of my face.
sorry about that. Is there a, after you've been studying food for so long, is there a useful and a non-reductionist way to operationalize the idea of cuisine?
Good question. I would rank cuisine up there with like foodways and diet as a statistical abstraction. So it's kind of like climate. We don't experience climate, we can experience weather. Well, cuisine is the same kind of way. We eat food, we don't eat cuisine. But cuisine is a super category that encompasses a lot of different kinds of food, and which usually refers to restaurants or historical sets of food that has been captured in print and in speech. So I would say, I don't think it's a universal category. I don't think everywhere has cuisine. I think everywhere can have cuisine. But Peru is a really good example. My most recent PhD, Emma McDonnell, worked on quinoa with quinoa farmers. But she also worked with this group of chefs in the big cities who were inventing a new Peruvian cuisine, and doing it in a way that's very reminiscent of the way cuisine is invented in Japan, the way it's been invented in Korea, and the way it's been invented in Thailand. And they see exactly the same kind of culinary nationalism as a way of carrying their food out into a global system where it will be a recognized genre. And it's a good example of common difference in that sense. But it's...
You defined it in two completely different ways.
Sorry?
You've now defined it in two completely different ways. On the one hand, you said it was a statistical abstract.
Yes.
And then you defined it as a practice that people engage in. So it's a practice that people engage in, and you said in just the same way
Yep.
as people do X, Y, or Z. So that would suggest that you do have an operational definition of what a cuisine is, or a culturological definition of what a cuisine is.
I think the Peruvians do, and the Koreans do, and all these other people do. Part of it comes from international organizations like UNESCO, which create these categories like cuisine. So yeah, it's a statistical abstraction in the sense that it's not a bunch of dishes, it's not a way of chopping up vegetables. It's, if you're asked to define exactly what a cuisine encompasses, you're going to get books and books and books and histories, and they're all going to be full of contending facts. So that's why I call it an abstraction. But it's an abstract category to which we all subscribe in one way or another, especially because we're willing to pay so much more money for cuisine than we are for cooking. And we see in a lot of different parts of the world that there's a conscious attempt to move from cooking to cuisine for exactly the same kind of set of reasons. It has material products, in the form of 100 different dishes made with braised quinoa. But it's going to be different in each place because it has to be in order to qualify as a cuisine. I think France still provides much of the model for how a cuisine can expand and become global in a relatively short period of time. But I see you still see a contradiction, so we can talk about it later.
I would like to now ask a historical question, but before I do, to just sort of continue on with this sort of love fest, I'd like to say, as a historian and a world historian, that I think that Rick's contributions to world history have really been very important, and he's done some really terrific work that I think historians recognize as outstanding history. Having said that, though, of course, historians inevitably sort of, however broad they start, even as world historians, once you start drawing down, you find the complexities of these sort of neat categories. And so I think that's a wonderful, important point that you made about sort of that we can't just assume that there's this sort of instrumental invention of terroir at the end of the 19th century, and sort of looking back at the categories and seeing how they're constructed from many centuries earlier is terrific, and sort of seeing how these tropes recur and how these battles get fought out in different ways. Although, and here's where the historian kind of comes in, is that, I mean, in any individual sort of categories, what you start to see is just how complex and how, it's not these very simple battles that sort of, the lines may follow along in a somewhat, apparently smooth path, but in fact, that, on the ground in those particular places, it gets so much more complex. And as an example of this, and a sort of, I guess my question is, I want to not so much from the early modern period, but one of the examples you pointed to, and that was Guinness. And it just happens that I was in Dublin at the Guinness Archive and was really blown away because, I've been trying to sort of follow this sort of world history of beer and from the kind of, the Imperial Archive, the British Library and these other things about, who was and was not drinking beer and that, if you read these official sources, they were keeping the natives, from drinking. But actually, when you look to the brewers, they know who their customers are, and they're not Englishmen. I'll qualify that by saying that they do drink Guinness sometimes, although it's oftentimes women and invalids who are drinking that. And actually, that Guinness, sort of is this strengthening thing but their real customers are the Chinese of Singapore. There's this amazing commodity chain setting up in the bazaar where they are the ones marketing it through there. It is West Africans, and to this day, Nigeria is, I think now, the largest consumer of Guinness. And so, and we could say, oh, this is all cultural imperialism and all that stuff, but I don't think so at all. And so, I think that although the big categories are there, what's really interesting, certainly, and to a historian, but also I think to an anthropologist, are the ways that those categories, kind of start to break apart the deeper you go into them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd say one of the privileges of retirement and age is that you get to make these kinds of generalizations without getting bogged down by the facts. But, I got a lot from the comparison of like the richest colony in the British Empire, Singapore, and the poorest colony in the British Empire, arguably British Honduras. And in both places, it's more the middle class who are trying to assert their legitimacy as members of the state who are most concerned with consuming the English products. Whereas the actual English expatriates, they were British. They didn't have to worry about their status. They went to Eton, or they went to, Cambridge, or they went to some other institution so that they could eat whatever the hell they wanted. And in many cases, they went hunting. I have a horrible mention of a pie made out of 500 parrot tongues, which is kind of horrifying, but also something no Belizean could ever imagine, eating. So there is a kind of, I see this in what I call a style sandwich often, and that is that it's aspiring people who are trying to gain status in a colonial system, which really disciplines people in a very firm way, but its discipline is mainly aimed at those indigenes who are trying to be civilized and who are trying the hardest. And there was a lot of scoffing by the British about these people. They tended to really make fun of what they called the jumped up native. But what we're seeing there is a kind of conflict over who's got legitimate knowledge and who's got legitimate rights. You see this among foodies. Who eats offal in the United States now? Hardly anybody except people with lots of cultural capital and lots of knowledge who have learned, to eat a kidney now and then, or have learned to butcher their own animals. Yeah, we could talk about this for another week. I imagine it's dark outside. People want to go, but thank you.